The air along Amsterdam's waterfront tasted of salt fish and ambition. A forest of masts swayed in the harbor, their rigging a delicate black lace against a pale morning sky. The docks themselves were a chaotic symphony of creaking wood, shouted orders, and the rhythmic splash of oars as lighters ferried goods to and from the great merchant ships. Here, in the heart of the Dutch Republic's burgeoning power, men with ledgers and maps were forging a new kind of empire, one built not on land but on contracts and courage. Among them stood Peter van der Heyden, his fine wool cloak pulled tight against the damp chill, his eyes reflecting the shimmering water and the boundless possibility it represented. He moved through the throng of stevedores and sailors with a purposeful stride, his mind churning with numbers and navigational charts. The whispers had been building for months, a current of excitement and trepidation swirling through the taverns and counting houses. Rival merchant companies, each financing their own perilous voyages to the fabled Spice Islands, were driving up prices and cutting each other's throats. The solution proposed by the most powerful men in the United Provinces was as radical as it was simple: consolidation. A single, united company granted a monopoly by the state to face the dangers and reap the rewards of the East. Peter entered the grand hall where the meeting was to be held, the scent of beeswax and old money replacing the fishy tang of the port. The room was filled with the low, serious murmur of men whose fortunes were already considerable, yet who were prepared to risk them for wealth beyond the dreams of kings. He saw faces etched with the lines of long sea voyages and others smoothed by a life of ledger-bound comfort. They were all gamblers, he realized. Whether they admitted it or not, the stakes were just higher today. The debate was fierce, a clash of cautious pragmatism and vaulting ambition. Some argued the risk was too great, that the Portuguese and English dominance was unassailable, that the storms of the Cape of Good Hope were a graveyard for Dutch ambition. But others, Peter among them, spoke of nutmeg and cloves, of peppercorns that were worth their weight in silver. They spoke of breaking the Iberian stranglehold, of creating a trade web that would encircle the globe and pour unimaginable riches into the coffers of the Republic. The air crackled with the energy of a new idea, a joint stock company that would pool the capital of many, spreading the risk and multiplying the reward. It was an innovation as revolutionary as the fluked ships that filled their harbor. When the representatives from the States General arrived, the room fell silent. The charter was unrolled, a vellum scroll dense with legal script that would grant the Dutch East India Company the Verenigde Oost-Indische Compagnie, or VOC, a 21-year monopoly on all Dutch trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. It was a document that bestowed the power to build fortresses, wage war, and negotiate treaties, a sovereign power handed to a corporation. Peter watched as the first signatures were applied, the scratch of the quill echoing in the hushed hall. It was the sound of history turning a page. Later, alone in his study overlooking a quiet canal, Peter laid out his own account books. The numbers stared back at him, the careful accumulation of a lifetime. His investment in the VOC would be the largest gamble he had ever taken. He thought of his family, the security he could provide, and the ruin that would follow failure. But then he looked out the window, past the gabled rooftops towards the invisible sea routes that stretched to the ends of the earth. He saw not just spices, but a legacy. He dipped his quill, the ink as black as the unknown ocean, and committed his fortune to the dream. The stage was set, not just for a voyage, but for the very birth of global commerce. The air in the new bears a verve. Amsterdam was a thick, living entity, a swirling vortex of sweat, damp wool, and the metallic tang of raw ambition. It was a sound before it was a place, a roaring, chaotic symphony of shouted numbers, frantic hand signals, and the frantic rustle of paper that promised fortunes or foretold ruin. Here, in this colonnaded courtyard that had become the world's first true stock exchange, the abstract idea of the VOC was forged into a tangible, terrifying, and intoxicating reality. Paper certificates representing slivers of a company that owned ships yet to be built for voyages yet to be sailed were now the most coveted commodities in the Republic. Claes de Vries stood at the edge of the frenzy, a baker whose hands were more accustomed to the gentle weight of dough than the perilous heft of speculation. The scent of his own oven still clung to his simple coat, a humble aroma lost in the aggressive perfume of wealth. He clutched the small leather pouch containing his life savings, coins, earned from 1,000 loaves of bread, each one a testament to slow, certain toil. The noise was a physical pressure against his ears, a cacophony that spoke of a new kind of alchemy, where money could beget money with dizzying speed. You watched men with sharp eyes and sharper elbows, seasoned traders who moved through the throng like sharks, their whispers causing ripples that swelled into waves of buying and selling. They were playing a game whose rules Claes did not fully understand, a game of perception and manipulation where the value of a thing was whatever the crowd, skillfully guided, could be made to believe it was. When he finally pushed his way to a broker's table, the transaction felt absurdly simple for the weight it carried. A few pieces of gold changed hands, and in return he was given a beautifully inscribed certificate. It was heavier than he expected. This single share of VO stock was not just paper. It was a key, he believed, to a future far from the pre-dawn chill of the bakery. He saw his own reflection in the polished wood of the exchange and imagined it transformed a man of means. His wife in fine silk, his children with tutors. He was no longer just a baker, he was an adventurer, his fate tied to the fortunes of ships cutting through southern oceans. In the days that followed, Claes' life acquired a new rhythm. Each morning, after the last batch of bread was drawn from the oven, he would hurry to the Beurs, his heart pounding with a new addictive anxiety. At first, his dream seemed prophetic. The price of VOC shares climbed a steady ascent fueled by relentless optimism and the clever machinations of the large investors. The whispers grew louder, tales of instant wealth making men like Claes giddy. He watched the numbers rise on the big board, mentally calculating the paper profit, a fortune built on air. The speculative bubble inflated, transparent and fragile, but to those caught inside its iridescent sphere, it felt as solid as the cobblestones underfoot. Then came the tremor. A rumor, started in a corner by a man Claes had come to recognize as one of the market's predators, slithered through the crowd. A whisper of a lost ship, a delay in the fleet's departure, a glut of pepper in Lisbon. The effect was instantaneous and brutal. The roaring confidence curdled into a panicked staccato. The same men who had been buying frantically hours before were now desperate to sell. The numbers on the board began to fall, not in a gentle decline, but in a sickening plunge. Claes stood frozen, his certificate suddenly feeling like a lead weight in his pocket. The paper fortune he had tallied just that morning evaporated before his eyes, a mirage dissolving in the desert of reality. The loss was not just of money, but of the future he had so vividly painted. The dream of silk and tutors receded, replaced by the stark, flower-dusted walls of his bakery. In the brutal theater of the exchange, he had learned his first costly lesson in the volatile heart of the new capitalism that a market built on shared dreams could collapse just as quickly under the weight of shared fear. The salt-stiffened banners of the Verenigde Oost-Indisch Compagnie snapped in the North Sea wind, a percussive counterpoint to the roar of the crowd gathered along Amsterdam's dikes. Thousands had come to witness the departure of Admiral Jacob van Heemskerk's fleet, a spectacle of national pride and personal terror. 11 ships, their hulls black and ponderous, their sails a vast untried wilderness of canvas, lay at anchor, transformed from drawings in a merchant's ledger into instruments of destiny. From the high deck of the flagship, the Amsterdam, the scene was a tapestry of human emotion cheers from wives and mothers, the stoic silence of investors like Peter van der Heyden, and the frantic last-minute loading of barrels and casks that held the difference between life and death on the open ocean. Among the swarm of activity on the main deck, young Jan van Dyck hauled on a coarse hemp line, his hands, still soft from a brief life inland, already burning with fresh blisters. The scale of the vessel was a world unto itself, a floating city of oak and ambition. He was one of 400 souls crammed into the wooden belly of the Amsterdam, a mix of seasoned sailors with skin like tanned leather and boys like himself, lured by the promise of adventure and a share of the profits. As the Admiral's signal flags ran up the halyard, a great cry went up from the shore, a wave of sounds that crashed over the ships and then receded, leaving behind the profound isolation of the deep. The anchor cables, groaning like living things, were hauled aboard, and the fleet began its slow, stately procession towards the open sea, the cheers fading into the mournful cries of gulls. The die was cast. The dream of the merchants and the speculation of the exchange were now in the hands of the wind and the waves. The first weeks were brutal education. The North Sea gave way to the vast grey expanse of the Atlantic, and the ocean showed its temper. A storm descended upon them not with warning, but with the sudden violence of a slammed door. The sky turned the color of a bruise, and the sea became a range of liquid mountains, each peak intent on dashing the ship to splinters. Jan lashed to the mainmast with a dozen others, wretched until his stomach was empty, his body convulsing with a fear so primal it erased all thought of nutmeg or gold. The world shrank to the groaning of the ship's timbers, the shriek of the wind in the rigging, and the terrifying sight of the deck tilting to near vertical as they slid into a trough between waves. Men worked the pumps in a ceaseless, desperate rhythm, their prayers lost in the storm's roar. It was in this shared crucible of terror that Jan found an unexpected bond with an old gunner named Hendrik, whose calm, scarred hands and steady presence became an anchor in the chaos. When the storm finally passed, leaving the fleet scattered and battered, a new, more insidious enemy emerged, scurvy. As the fresh food dwindled, the sickness crept through the lower decks like a thief. First, the lethargy, a profound weariness that made the simplest task a Herculean effort. Then the gums swelled, turning purple and spongy, bleeding at the slightest touch. Old wounds reopened, and the men's bodies became maps of purple blotches. The hold, once filled with the smells of tar and salt pork, was now thick with the sweet, foul odor of decay. Jan watched strong men wither into listless skeletons, their moans a constant haunting chorus. He shared his meager ration of hardtack with Hendrik, who could no longer chew, and in that small act of mercy the hierarchy of the ship dissolved, replaced by the raw democracy of suffering. The misery bred a venomous discontent. Whispers began to circulate in the fetid darkness below decks, murmurs of a captain leading them to a watery grave, of a voyage cursed by greed. The plot, a near mutiny, coalesced around a hulking, desperate Cooper who argued for turning back. It was Hendrik, his voice a weak rasp but his eyes still fierce, who confronted the man not with force but with the grim reality of their position. To turn back now with the winds against them and their supplies rotting was a slower death sentence. The moment hung in the balance, a spark away from conflagration, until the lookout's cry from the crow's nest shattered the tension. Sail! Sail to the east! Every man who could stand scrambled to the rails. On the horizon, a strange cark with the distinctive lines of a Portuguese vessel slid into view, a ghost from a rival empire. The sight was an electric shock. The internal threat was instantly forgotten, replaced by the ancient unifying instinct of an external foe. Admiral van Heemskerk's orders rang out crisp and clear. and the fleet shifted from a collection of suffering vessels into a weapon. A war, the shared hardship, the storm, the sickness, and the averted mutiny had forged them, for better or worse, into a crew. As they altered course, the unknown seas ahead no longer seemed just a perilous emptiness, but a chessboard of empires, and they were now players in the game. The scent reached them long before the islands themselves materialized from the haze, a dizzying perfume of clove and nutmeg, of damp earth and blooming frangipani, a promise so potent it seemed to cleanse the lingering stench of scurvy and brine from their very lungs. For the men of the VOC fleet, the Banda Islands were not just landfall. They were the culmination of a year of suffering, the physical embodiment of the dream that had launched them from Amsterdam. The green volcanic peaks rose from a turquoise sea like emeralds scattered on sapphire silk, their slopes a dense, dark tangle of foliage that hid the source of unimaginable wealth. As the Amsterdam's anchor splashed into the impossibly clear water, Jan van Dyck leaned over the rail, his eyes wide, trying to imprint every detail. This was the prize. This was what men died for. Ashore, the air was thick and humid, heavy with the same intoxicating aroma. The Dutch envoys, clad in heavy woolens that were already sticking to their skin, moved with a stiff formality through a world of fluid grace. They were led to the court of Sultan Heran, a man who ruled not from a stone fortress, but from an open-sided pavilion woven from bamboo and palm fronds. The cultural chasm was immediate and profound. The Dutch saw a simple, almost primitive setting. The Bandanese saw a civilization in harmony with its land. The Sultan, adorned with intricate gold jewelry and seated on woven mats, observed the pale, bearded men with a calm, inscrutable gaze. His people moved with a quiet dignity, their bare feet silent on the packed earth, a stark contrast to the heavy, purposeful tread of the soldiers in their polished metal breastplates. The negotiations began under the shade of great banyan trees, the air buzzing with insects and unspoken tensions. The VOC commander, his chin held high, laid out maps and contracts speaking of exclusive trade agreements, of fixed prices, of a monopoly granted by a distant government the Sultan had never heard of. He spoke the language of ledgers and law, of absolute control. Sultan Heran listened, his interpreters softly conveying the foreign demands. He then spoke of tradition, of the trade networks that stretched across the archipelago for generations, of the sacred relationship between his people and the land that fed them. He offered friendship and a share of the harvest. He could not comprehend the European hunger for totality, the need to own not just the spice, but the very tree it grew on. The greed of the VOC, a cold, calculating force, pressed against the Sultan's worldview, a clash as fundamental as the collision of continents. Jan assigned to a work detail hauling trade. Goods barrels of silver coins and bolts of coarse cloth caught glimpses of the spice groves. He slipped away from his comrades for a moment, drawn into the shadowy coolness beneath the canopy. The nutmeg trees grew in ordered rows, their branches heavy with golden apricot-like fruits. He saw local boys shimmying up the trunks with effortless agility, their laughter echoing in the grove. He reached out and touched the rough bark of a tree, his calloused hand connecting with the source of all the frenzy in Amsterdam, all the storms and the sickness. The sheer vibrant life of the place was overwhelming. It felt sacred, a world away from the sterile calculations of a stock exchange. He knew with a sudden cold certainty that his countrymen would not be content to simply trade for this bounty. They would want to possess it, and the peace of this lush paradise was as fragile as a dried leaf. Back at the pavilion, the negotiations reached their climax. The VOC commander, frustrated by the Sultan's refusal to cede absolute control, produced a new document. It was a treaty, he explained through the interpreter, of friendship and mutual benefit. The terms were vague, written in Dutch, a language of swirling script the Sultan could not read. He was offered gifts, fine mirrors, a clock, a ceremonial sword, and assurances of the company's peaceful intentions. The air was thick with deception. Under the pressure of the Dutch presence and the gleaming display of European goods, Sultan Hayran, seeking to preserve a fragile peace for his people, made his mark upon the parchment. It was not a signature, but a symbol, a gesture of trust that was being systematically betrayed even as the ink dried. The Dutch smiles were tight, their eyes already scanning the high ground for the best location for a fort. Within days, the sound of hammers and saws replaced the gentle rhythms of the island. A site was cleared on a commanding hill overlooking the bay, and the foundations of a fortified trading post were laid. The sturdy geometric lines of European stone began to encroach upon the organic curves of the jungle. Jan and the other sailors labored alongside soldiers, hauling blocks of coral and mortar, their work watched by silent groups of Bandonese men. The friendly curiosity in their eyes had been replaced by a hard, wary understanding. The VOC was not just building a warehouse, they were planting a flag, a statement of ownership carved from stone and ambition. The intoxicating scent of nutmeg and clove now mingled with the dust of construction and the sharp tang of fear, foreshadowing the bitter conflict that was already taking root in the fertile soil. The paradise of spice and shadow was hardening into a fortress of stone and ambition. The hill overlooking the Banda Island's prime harbor, once a lush promontory alive with the chatter of monkeys and the scent of blooming ginger, was now a raw, geometric scar upon the landscape. Under the relentless command of Hendrik Brouwer, a man whose face seemed carved from the same granite his men were quarrying, the foundations of Fort Belgica were being laid. For weeks, the rhythmic crash of pickaxes and the grating drag of sledges filled the air, a brutal symphony of coercion that drowned out the island's natural music. Jan van Dyck, his muscles aching from a new kind of labor, hauled coral blocks under the equatorial sun, the sweat stinging the salt cracks in his hands. He watched as the local men, once curious observers, were now conscripted into the work gangs, their movements sullen and slow under the watchful eyes of VOC soldiers armed with matchlocks and whips. This was no longer trade. It was an imposition of will, the physical manifestation of the company's power. Brouwer stalked the nascent ramparts, his boots kicking up puffs of white coral dust. He was not a merchant. He was a soldier, and he saw the world in terms of strongpoints and vulnerabilities. The treaty with Sultan Hayran was a piece of paper, a temporary convenience. True control, he knew, resided in the ability to project force, to command the sea approaches and cow the land into submission. Fort Belgica was to be a statement in stone, a five-pointed bastion of such overwhelming strength that no local uprising, no rival European power would ever dare challenge the VOC's dominion over these precious islands. His ambition was not for personal wealth, but for the absolute, unassailable supremacy of the company, a goal he pursued with a cold, ruthless focus. That focus was soon tested on the open water. A scout ship came racing into the harbor, its sails taut with urgent news. A Portuguese carrack, heavy with spices and armed for a fight, had been sighted off the coast of Java, threatening to intercept the next inbound VOC fleet. The Portuguese, the old masters of these seas, were not yet ready to cede their dominance to the upstart Dutch. Brouwer saw the threat not as a setback, but as an opportunity. A decisive victory would shatter Portuguese morale and cement the VOC's reputation as the new naval power in the East. He immediately ordered his two most nimble warships, the Dolphin and the Zeehond, to sea with instructions to hunt down and destroy the rival. Jan, along with his old comrade Hendrik, was transferred from the construction site to the gun deck of the Zeehond. The world of dust and stone exchanged for one of tar, salt, and the imminent promise of violence. The two fleets sighted each other at dawn off the Javan coast, the Portuguese vessel a dark, towering silhouette against the bleeding hues of the eastern sky. What followed was not a battle of grand strategy, but a brutal close-quarters brawl. The ships closed, the air between them thickening with the sulphurous smoke of burning gunpowder as the broadsides roared. The world dissolved into a chaos of screaming shot, splintering wood, and the screams of men, and Jan worked frantically with his gun crew hauling the heavy. Cannon back into position, swabbing the hot barrel, ramming home the next charge. The acrid smoke burned his lungs and stung his eyes, reducing the conflict to a series of terrifying, disjointed moments. He saw Hendrik, his face a mask of soot and concentration, calmly directing their fire at the enemy's waterline. Then came the enemy's answering volley. A storm of wooden shrapnel erupted from the Zeehond's bulwark. A hot, sharp agony seared through Jan's thigh, a piece of oak splinter the size of a man's thumb burying itself deep in the muscle. He cried out, collapsing onto the blood-slicked deck, the world swimming in a haze of pain. Hendrik was at his side in an instant, his strong hands tearing a strip of canvas to staunch the flow of blood. The battle raged on around them, the thunder of the guns a distant echo to the pounding in Jan's ears. He was dragged below into the reeking darkness of the orlop deck, where the ship's surgeon worked amidst the moans of the dying, the bloody. Skirmish was a visceral lesson in the true cost of the spices he had once marveled at. A price paid not in silver, but in flesh and suffering. Above, the battle turned. The Dutch ships, more maneuverable and their crews better drilled, outmaneuvered the heavier Portuguese carrack. A final devastating broadside smashed into its stern, and a cheer went up from the Dutch sailors as the enemy's flag was slowly, reluctantly hauled down. When Commander Brouwer received the report of the victory aboard the captured Portuguese vessel, his satisfaction was grim and calculating. He walked the splinter deck, observing the cost of his ambition in the broken bodies and the prize of spices in the hold. He looked from the wounded, like Jan van Dyck being carried ashore, to the formidable, half-completed walls of Fort Belgica rising on the horizon. The two scenes were connected, two facets of the same relentless purpose. In that moment, he made his decision. The victory was not an end, but a beginning. He would dispatch orders to Batavia, demanding more troops, more ships. The VOC would not merely trade, it would conquer. It would expand its military footprint across the archipelago, crushing any and all resistance with overwhelming force. The dream of the Amsterdam merchants had finally shed its last vestige of mercantile innocence, revealing the ruthless, coercive heart of corporate power. The wealth of the East returned to Amsterdam not as a trickle, but as a golden flood, transforming the city's very soul. The canals, once functional arteries for trade and drainage, now glittered with a new, opulent purpose, their dark waters reflecting the grand gabled facades of houses that seemed to sprout like stone flowers nourished by spice. Each arriving VOC flute ship, its hold packed to the beams with nutmeg, cloves, and pepper, was a floating treasury, its cargo destined for the feverish theater of the spice auctions. And at the center of this whirlwind of newfound fortune stood Peter van der Heyden, the merchant whose gamble had paid off 100-fold. His initial investment, once a source of sleepless anxiety, had matured into a river of gold, funding a lifestyle that bordered on the regal. The auctions themselves were dramatic spectacles of pure avarice, held in the high-ceilinged halls of the East India House. The air was thick with the intoxicating perfume of the spices themselves, a sharp, peppery scent layered over the sweet, narcotic aroma of nutmeg mingling with the smell of expensive wool, perfumed wigs, and the sweat of nervous men. The auctioneer's gavel was a conductor's baton for a symphony of commerce, his chanted numbers rising in a relentless crescendo as merchants, their eyes gleaming with competitive fire, drove prices to dizzying heights. Peter stood among them, a figure of calm authority, his discreet nods sending prices soaring and securing the finest lots for his syndicate. Each crash of the gavel was the sound of another fortune being made, another cascade of guilders flowing into the coffers of the VOC and its investors, fueling an economic boom that felt limitless. This newfound wealth demanded a physical monument, and Amsterdam's skyline was reshaped by it. Peter commissioned a new house on the Herengracht, the most prestigious of the concentric canals. It was a palace of brick and sandstone, its facade adorned with sculpted festoons and a pediment depicting Mercury, the god of commerce. Inside, the floors were of polished marble, the walls hung with heavy silk damask, and the ceilings painted with allegorical scenes celebrating trade and abundance. He became a patron of the arts, his wealth spilling onto the canvases of rising masters who captured the serene beauty of the Dutch landscape and the quiet dignity of its burghers. In his opulent feasts, the bounty of the world was laid upon his table. Wines from France, fruits from Spain, and, the crowning glory, dishes richly seasoned with the very spices that had funded it all. The conversation was of shipbuilding innovations, the sleek, efficient fleet that could carry more cargo with fewer men, and of new financial instruments, a world being built and refined by the golden flow from the east. Yet just a stone's throw from the glittering canals and the grand houses, a different Amsterdam festered. Down by the Seine docks where the VOC ships were unloaded, the human machinery that powered the golden flow lived in a world of grime and grinding poverty. The dock workers, their backs bent under the weight of spice sacks, their lungs filled with the dust of pepper and cinnamon, returned each night to damp, cramped quarters. Theirs was a world of thin broth and hard bread, a stark contrast to the feasts a few blocks away. They saw the merchants in their fine carriages, heard the laughter echoing from the taverns where traders celebrated, and felt the vast, unbridgeable chasm of the new inequality. The wealth that built the palaces on the canal was extracted from distant islands by force and delivered to the city by the calloused hands of men who would never taste its true rewards. The Golden Age had two faces, one gilded and serene, looking out over tranquil water, the other gaunt and soot-stained, staring into the cold depths of the Seine canals, a silent testament to the brutal calculus of the world's first corporate empire. The nutmeg groves of Banda were a living hell disguised as paradise. Beneath the emerald canopy where dappled sunlight danced through leaves, human bodies moved in a relentless, brutal rhythm. City's world had shrunk to the patch of earth around her assigned tree, her existence measured in the number of golden fruits she could gather before the sun reached its zenith. The intoxicating scent of nutmeg, once the perfume of her homeland, now clung to her like a shroud, a constant reminder that her freedom had been bartered for this spice. Her hands, once skilled at weaving intricate patterns into palm leaves, were now raw and cracked, stained with the earthy pulp of the fruit. The VOC's whip cracked in the humid air, a sound as regular as the cicada's drone, punctuating the silence of forced labor. Each lash was a message, written on the air and sometimes on flesh. You are property, and your purpose is production. From the shaded veranda of the plantation's administrative house, Cornelis de Houtman watched the scene through a haze of discomfort that had nothing to do with the equatorial heat. He was a junior VOC official, a man of ledgers and quotas sent to Banda to ensure the efficiency of this lucrative enterprise. The ledger in front of him was immaculate, its columns of numbers detailing a triumphant flow of wealth, so many guilders' worth of nutmeg harvested, processed, and shipped. But his eyes kept straying from the neat figures to the human cost that generated them. He saw City, her back bent as she worked, a quiet dignity in her posture that seemed to defy the hand, degradation of her circumstances. He saw the blank exhaustion in the eyes of the other workers, the way they flinched at sudden movements. The moral arithmetic of the situation was a problem his merchant's training had not prepared him to solve. The wealth of Amsterdam, the very shares traded on the Bourse, were built upon this foundation of suffering. His conscience, a quiet but persistent voice, had begun to document its own ledger of abuses, one that no shareholder would ever see. Citi's rebellion was not one of open defiance, but of a spirit that refused to be extinguished. It lived in the secret, careful way she would sometimes leave a perfectly ripe fruit to fall and rot beneath its tree, a tiny, silent act of sabotage. It lived in the low, humming songs she would whisper in her native tongue to the other women as they worked, melodies that spoke of rivers and mountains and a time before chains. A most daring act of rebellion, however, was a plan born of sheer desperation. Under the cover of a moonless night, when the jungle was a chorus of unseen life, she and two others would slip away. They had studied the guards' routines, identified a gap in the patrols along the rocky coastline where a small, hidden outrigger canoe was concealed. The plan was to reach one of the outer, less watched islands, a journey of immense risk across open water. Freedom was a distant star, but for a moment it felt within reach. The escape attempt was a brief, frantic burst of hope that ended in the cold grip of reality. They had barely pushed the canoe into the surf when a shout echoed from the darkness. A patrol, alerted by a nervous informant, or simply by cruel chance, descended upon them. The ensuing struggle was short and brutal. City was dragged back to the plantation, her arms bruised, her spirit battered but not broken. The punishment was swift and public, a flogging administered at the base of her own nutmeg tree as a lesson to all. As the whip fell, Cornelis de Houtman turned away from his window, his stomach churning. The sound was worse than the sight. He could close his eyes, but he could not block out the stark, moral failure the sound represented. The efficiency of his operation was maintained by this brutality. The neat columns in his ledger were written in blood. That night, by the flickering light of a single oil lamp, Cornelis opened a small personal journal. The official report he would send to Batavia would speak only of a minor disciplinary issue, efficiently resolved. But in this private book, he began to write a different truth. He documented the failed escape, the flogging, the meager rations, the arbitrary punishments. He wrote of City, not as a unit of labor, but as a person whose will remained unbroken. His pen scratched across the page, each word an act of quiet treason against the company he served. In documenting the dark underpinnings of the VOC's wealth, he was not just recording facts, he was bearing witness. The golden flow that glittered in Amsterdam's canals had its source here, in the suffering of the Bandanese soil, and for the first time Cornelis de Houtman understood that the true cost of spice could never be calculated in guilders alone. The tendrils of the VOC's ambition had woven themselves across the globe, stitching together continents with threads of commerce, coercion, and capital. From the spice-scented docks of Batavia to the sugar plantations of Brazil, from the silk markets of Persia to the silver mines of Japan, the company's ships traced a web of unprecedented scale, each voyage a pulse of wealth flowing back to the heart of the Dutch Republic. In Amsterdam, the consequences of this global entanglement were not just measured in the guilders piling up in merchant coffers, but in the very ideas circulating through the city's smoke-filled cafes and elegant drawing rooms. The abstract forces of supply and demand, once confined to local markets, were now planetary in scope, and men with ink-stained fingers and hungry minds were beginning to divine the laws that governed this new world. Peter van der Heyden stood before a vast, newly completed map that dominated the wall of his Herrengrach study. It was a cartographic marvel depicting the world not as a collection of separate kingdoms, but as a single interconnected system of trade winds and mercantile routes. Red silk threads, pinned by his own hand, traced the VOC's pathways, the outward passage south to the Cape, the roaring 40s to Java, the return voyage across the Indian Ocean. He saw not just geography, but a nervous system of capital, with Amsterdam as its brain. The wealth it generated was no longer a mystery or a miracle. It was the predictable outcome of control over supply chains and the manipulation of markets. This understanding had transformed him from a mere merchant into a strategist of global commerce. At a meeting of the VOC's governing board, the Huron 17, he listened to reports of rising costs and competition from the English East India Company. When others counseled caution, retrenchment, he rose to his feet, his voice calm but ironclad. He argued not for consolidation, but for aggressive, relentless expansion. He pointed to the map, to the uncharted coasts and the untapped markets. The web, he insisted, must grow larger, its strands stronger. To stand still was to be overtaken. The future belonged not to the nation with the largest army, but to the corporation with the most far-reaching network and the most ruthless application of economic power. This new reality was being dissected and debated in the bustling cafes along the dam rack. Here, amidst the clatter of clay pipes and coffee cups, a new language was being born, the language of capitalism. Men who had never set foot on a ship discussed the finer points of arbitrage, the flow of bullion, and the theoretical merits of free trade against the VOC's state-enforced monopoly. The scent of roasting coffee beans, another global commodity, mixed with the intellectual fervor. They debated whether wealth was finite, a treasure to be hoarded, or whether trade itself could create new value, expanding the pie for all. The VOC's practices its monopolies, its violent enforcement of contracts, its corporate sovereignty were the living, breathing case study for these early theories. The company was not just a participant in the global economy, it was its most powerful and controversial architect. It was into this hothouse of ideas that Jan van Dyck finally returned. The Nordster docked on a grey morning, its timbers scarred by tropical sun and southern gales, its crew a collection of gaunt, weathered faces. Jan stepped onto the familiar stones of Amsterdam, but the city felt different, smaller, its ordered canals a stark contrast to the sprawling chaos of Asian ports. He was no longer the wide-eyed boy who had left. He was a man whose body bore the map of his journeys, the puckered scar on his thigh from the Java battle, the squint lines around his eyes from staring at endless horizons. In a tavern popular with returning sailors, he found himself surrounded by merchants and clerks, men hungry for news from the ends of the earth. He did not speak of ledgers or profit margins. Instead, he spoke of the world. He described the intricate court rituals of the shogun in Japan, where VOC traders were confined to a tiny artificial island and treated with a mixture of curiosity and contempt. He told of the vast, ordered bureaucracy of Ming China, a civilization so ancient it made Amsterdam feel like an adolescent. He recounted the vibrant, chaotic bazaars of Surat, where 100 languages mingled in the air like the scent of incense and spices. His tales were not of conquest, but of cultures, of the breathtaking, bewildering diversity of human life that the VOC's web now connected. He spoke of the Javanese craftsman whose skill with batik was an art form, of the Arab astronomers who navigated by stars unknown in European skies. His words painted a picture of a planet far larger and more complex than the neat red lines on Peter van der Heyden's map could ever convey. The VOC's impact was not merely economic, it was cultural, a violent and voluntary mixing of worlds on a scale never before seen. The spices, the silks, and the silver were the tangible cargo, but the true, unstoppable import was the knowledge of the globe itself, a revelation that was slowly, irrevocably, changing the Dutch understanding of their place in it. The world was no longer a collection of distant myths, it was a single interconnected stage, and the VOC had written itself a leading role in the first act of a global drama. The scent of decay had settled over the grand houses of the Herengracht, a subtle rot that no amount of beeswax polish or fresh-cut flowers could conceal. It was the smell of moth-eaten velvet, of damp creeping into neglected cellars, of fortunes quietly mouldering away. In his cavernous study, the once vibrant maps now faded and brittle. Peter van der Heyden sat as a monument to his own legacy. His hands, gnarled and spotted with age, rested on the polished arm of his chair, their grip no longer capable of signing contracts that could alter the fate of nations. The golden flow had long since slowed to a trickle, and now, in the late 1700s, it had stopped entirely. The news, whispered by nervous clerks and shouted in the streets, was of bankruptcy. The Verenigde Oost-Indisch Compagnie, the colossus that had bested empires and woven a global web, was collapsing under the weight of its own corrupted grandeur. The dream of Amsterdam's merchants was ending not with a bang, but with the dry administrative rustle of a dissolution order. The final, convulsive shudder was felt on the floor of the Amsterdam Stock Exchange. The same colonnaded courtyard that had once roared with the frenzied birth of speculation now echoed with a different, more hollow sound. The death rattle of a financial titan. The board that had once displayed soaring numbers for VOC shares was a stark canvas of zeros. Men who had built their identities on the paper wealth of the company stood in stunned silence, their faces ashen. It was not a sudden crash, but a long, sickening slide, accelerated by the cost of endless wars in the East, by the rampant corruption of company officials lining their own pockets, and by the sheer, unsustainable weight of a corporate state that had forgotten how to turn a profit. The speculative bubble, inflated over 2 centuries, had finally popped, leaving behind not riches but the dusty ghost of a monopoly. Claes de Vries's long-ago lesson in the volatility of capitalism was being taught one last, brutal time to an entire generation. From his window, Peter watched the city his wealth had helped to shape. He saw the gabled roofs, the tranquil canals, the very stones of a metropolis built on nutmeg and cloves. But his mind's eye saw, further to the fortified ports of Java, the spice groves of Banda, the blood-soaked decks of warships. He pondered the consequences of the power he had helped to unleash. The VOC had been a sovereign without a nation, a corporation that could wage war and enact laws, its ambition untethered from any morality but the balance sheet. It had been an innovation as profound as the stock market itself, and he saw now that such concentrated power carried within it the seeds of its own destruction. The relentless pursuit of profit had demanded ever greater coercion, ever more costly conquest, until the machine could no longer feed itself. He had dreamed of a legacy of wealth and influence. He was left with the chilling lesson that corporate empires, like all empires, are subject to the same immutable laws of rise and fall. His somber reflection was interrupted by a quiet commotion at his door. His steward, looking uncomfortable, ushered in 2 visitors. They were a young man and a woman, their features and bearing marking them as unmistakably from the East Indies. Their clothes were simple but clean, and they held themselves with the quiet, unyielding dignity that filled the opulent room. The woman's eyes, dark and direct, held Peter's gaze, and in them he saw a profound, generations-old grief. They were descendants of Siti, the enslaved woman from the Banda plantations, whose story of rebellion had been a quiet, persistent whisper in the company's records. They had not come for charity or vengeance, but for acknowledgement. They spoke softly through an interpreter of a legacy of a different kind of land stolen, of cultures shattered, of a debt that could never be repaid in guilders. They sought a justice that was beyond the power of any court, a simple recognition of the human cost upon which his fortune had been built. The encounter left Peter van der Heyden hollowed out and strangely clarified. The final, poignant scene of the VOC's long drama was not played out in a boardroom or on a battlefield, but in the quiet of a fading merchant's study, between the architect of an empire and the living echoes of its victims. The company was dissolving, its charter revoked, its ships sold, its name soon to be a footnote in history books. But its legacy was not so easily erased. It was written in the globalized world it had forged, in the capitalist systems it had pioneered, and in the deep, enduring scars it had left on distant lands and peoples. The rise and fall of the Dutch East India Company was a testament to the heights of human ambition and innovation, and a timeless warning of the corruption and ruin that follow when power is divorced from conscience. The empire of the VOC was gone, but its echoes would reverberate for centuries.